guys, are you still shooting auto modes or even program modes on your camera? Maybe you don't know how to control the settings or you're not sure when to use them. Things like making the background nice and soft, how to control motion blur in your photos or videos. Let's go take a look.
My name's Damien. Welcome to day 2 of COVID lockdown. Have you ever tried to take a picture and it's either too dark or too bright and you don't know how to correct it, or your focus is not quite as deep or as shallow as you'd like? Well, we're here to dive into your camera settings and help you take better control over it. So let's jump straight in. So the first option we're going to look at is exposure compensation. On your camera, you'll find it either on a dial, otherwise it'll be in the menu somewhere. Just comment below if you need help with a specific camera and I'll see what I can do to help you. So exposure compensation allows you to shoot in auto modes, but still adjust your exposure. My camera, for instance, allows me to increase or decrease the exposure by up to 3 stops. There's nothing wrong either with using auto mode, especially if you're outdoors. For example, if you're out at a festival, traveling the streets, out in broad daylight on the beach, you don't want to have to worry about manual controls and adjusting your settings every time you take a picture. So exposure compensation allows you to adjust where your camera isn't quite clever enough to know exactly what you're wanting to do. So these 3 images were all taken in auto. This one being with the -1 exposure, you can see it's a little bit dark and underexposed. Now we have a correctly exposed image with a 0 exposure compensation. Then we added +1 to the next one, which you can see is a little bit brighter than the others. Alright, so now let's kick into manual modes. The first one we're going to look at is aperture. And unless you're shooting in full manual mode, you can switch over to aperture priority, which is indicated by an AV on Canon cameras or an A on Nikon cameras. And what an aperture is a small ring inside your lens, and as you widen the aperture, it gets bigger and allows a little more light in. As you close your aperture, it gets smaller, it allows less light in. So if we have a look here at Yoda and Chewie, you'll find Yoda's nice and crisp. Chewie, you can kind of make out what he is, but the blurry guy in the back, you can't see what it is. Here we're shooting with an aperture of f2.8, which is very wide. Apertures do go wider, but the lenses that I have max out at 2.8. So let's close this aperture down to f5.6, and you'll see how it's getting slightly darker. f8, f16, and here we have f22. You can see it's quite a bit darker. So why not just shoot auto mode and use exposure compensation to make the pictures lighter or darker? Well, let us have a look at what aperture does to the picture, and then you'll see why. So let's take a look at the first one again. You can see Yoda perfectly clear. Chewie's a little bit out of focus, and a little blur at the back, you can't see quite what he or she is. Pick up to f5.6, f8, f16. Here we have Yoda perfectly clear, Chewie pretty much perfectly clear as well, and Harry at the back, he's kind of clear, but you can see exactly who he is. So what's happening here is when you have a wide open aperture, your depth of field is very shallow. So you can see the subject clearly, but as you go further and further behind the subject, it gets more and more out of focus. And once you start closing your aperture, you broaden that depth of field so you can see more clearly behind and in front of the subject. Let's have a look at a few images from a fellow photographer, and I'll show you in a few different images how this works. So as you can see, aperture priority can be used to get those great images where you want a nice soft background to draw the attention to the subject. So as you can see, you can't just use aperture alone to adjust the light coming in and out. You're going to affect the image by adjusting the depth of field. If you don't have a lens that goes down to 2.8, your kit lenses, for example, are generally 3.5 to 5.6, so you can't really open the aperture that much. A little trick that you can use, if you're trying to draw attention to a specific subject, you can go as close as you can go to that subject and open your aperture as much as possible. The closer you are to the subject, the more shallow the depth of field is going to be behind the subject. Also, if you use a zoom lens and you zoom in as much as you can and go as close as you can to the subject, that will also emphasize the subject more and give you a more shallow depth of field. Next up, let's have a look at shutter speed. So the shutter sits just in front of the sensor in your camera, and when you open the shutter, it lets in light onto the sensor, and that's how you capture an image. So obviously, the longer the shutter is open, the more light you're letting in. The shorter it's open, the less light you're letting in. So if we have a look at these images quickly, you'll see this first one is shot with a shutter speed of 1,000th of a second. The shutter itself opens and closes within 1,000th of a second. Let's brighten our image up a little bit by going to 1/250th of a second, and 1/125th of a second, and then 1/60th of a second. See how much brighter it is. But I'm sure you also notice the other issue we're running into. What I'm going to do is brighten all these images to the same exposure. Now you can see the difference between the shot that we took at 1/1000th of a second and the shot at 1/60th of a second. Chewie swinging on the end of a USB cord there is a bit blurry in this one. You can kind of see what he is or who he is, but it's not the way you want the picture to be. Here at 1/1000th of a second, you can see exactly who he is. He's crystal clear and there's no motion blur. The shutter opens and closes much quicker and is able to capture and freeze frame the image. So shutter speed is often used by sports photographers where they need a fast shutter speed to freeze frame action. On the other end of the scale, landscape photographers, especially if they want to capture water and get the water nice and smooth and flowing, they use low shutter speeds to allow the camera to capture that motion over time. Let's have a look at a local photographer's work and I'll show you what I mean. So in these first two landscape images, you can see how he controlled the shutter speed nicely to capture the water and get it looking nice and misty and flowing and smooth. You'll see the clouds still look pretty sharp, the sun looks pretty sharp, but that's also because they don't move as fast relative to the water in front of you. He's also taken some sports shots, and here you can see even though that hockey stick is moving pretty quick, it's captured nice and clear and crisp. Here again, nice high shutter speed to capture the action, although slow enough to capture a little bit of motion in the ball, so it tells a nice story in the picture. So think of ISO like a volume control in your TV. You can turn it up to get more volume, you can turn it down to get less volume. But the more you turn it up, especially if you turn it too high, it starts distorting and sounds terrible. So you don't really want to keep it like that. Well, let's have a look at ISO quickly and see what ISO does to our images. So these images were shot on a Fuji X-H1, and the Fuji's ISO, I must say, is very impressive. Although even the Fuji will battle at this rate. ISO 200 on the left, nice and clear. ISO 25,600 on the right. Let's zoom in a little bit and see what it does to Yoda's face. So by increasing the ISO, you're turning up a volume control for gain. But what happens is the more you turn it up, the more distorted it gets. In this case, the image is getting very noisy. So you can still clearly see what it is, but you don't want an image to be noisy like that. So as a rule of thumb, you can set your ISO to the following. For full-on daylight, 100 to 200 should be fine. For mid-morning or mid-afternoon, ISO 400 is a better choice. If you're shooting indoors, 800 to 1600 should be fine if you've got open windows or lights on. Then sunset, sunrise, 1600 to 3200 if you need to. Obviously the lower you can go the better, especially if it is for a sunrise or a sunset. Then obviously before sunrise or after sunset you'd have to shoot in a higher ISO. Right, so thank you for watching and I hope you found it helpful. Please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, comment in the comment section below about any videos that you would like to see, any ideas that you can give me to film, and I'd be happy to put that forward to you. Okay, see you next time.